Your book is called When Men and Mountains Meet. Now, what's the story of this book?
The story of the book, Paul, is basically when the Adirondacks became a land of opportunity after the American Revolution. Prior to that point, it was an unknown wilderness. And after the American Revolution, there was all sorts of schemes to develop the area with commercial enterprises. And in a sense, that's when the men came into the area and confronted the mountains.
So what happened with these opportunities? Did it become the land of opportunity that these men had envisioned?
Unfortunately not. A lot of the stories, which began in hope and much enthusiasm, ended in despair and in many cases human tragedy.
Now, what do you mean by tragedy?
Well, tragedy in the sense that many of the folks who had tried to develop the area went bankrupt and experienced all sorts of financial difficulties. I remember visiting with a descendant of John Brown, who's today says the Adirondacks were a curse on the family because of the devastation it created to their wealth. Then you had someone like David Parrish, who developed the area around Ogdensburg, who went back to Europe and drowned himself in the Danube River in Vienna. So there is some real downside to some of these exploits.
Well, what was happening with the Adirondacks in the time after the American Revolution that made it not so accommodating to these opportunities that people had in mind?
There was a lot of misinformation about the Adirondacks. They thought because you could grow crops in Albany and you could grow crops in Montreal, it was natural at a time when agricultural society was tantamount, they could grow things in the Adirondacks. Of course, those of us who have gardens realize there's only 95 frost-free days, makes it very difficult. You also had the terrain. Obviously, the mountains themselves prohibited bringing in canals, made it very difficult to bring in roads. So if you had an area within the Adirondacks that produced products, in many cases you couldn't get those products out of the Adirondacks. And in many of the problems we experience today.
So people back then had these grand visions for what the Adirondacks could be. What were some of these grandiose visions?
Well, my favorite is Casterland, which is over in the western part of the Adirondacks called Lowville. And their dream for the area, originally they were going to buy 600,000 acres. They wound up owning just 180,000 because they couldn't raise enough money. They had hoped to create 2 European-style cities with a population 4 times the size of Albany, with museums, formal gardens, broad avenues. They'd hoped to come up the Black River 35 miles into the Adirondacks with seagoing ships, totally unaware of all the waterfalls they would encounter. And they ran into one problem after another, and that was a development that quickly imploded upon itself.
So what would the Adirondacks look like or be like today if some of these visions had come true? For example, the 2 European-style cities.
Well, the people behind that, Paul, was a syndicate they called the New York Company from Paris. They were French-speaking. So if it had succeeded, the area of the Western Adirondacks might very well be speaking French today.
And doesn't Napoleon Bonaparte play a role in your book?
He certainly does. Few realize that after Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, that his brother Joseph hoped to get him out of Europe and escape to the Adirondacks and rebuild an empire here.
So Napoleon could have had an empire here in North America.
Exactly, and there is a lake just east of Fort Drum to this day is called Lake Bonaparte.
Well, speaking of world leaders, we're celebrating the birthday of George Washington this month. Do you mention him in your book?
He is mentioned in the book, and there's a story I'd love to share with your viewers. The city of Ogdensburg is named for Colonel Samuel Ogden. There's no evidence that Ogden ever was in Ogdensburg. He was a speculator from New Jersey, and very good friend with his brother Abraham with George Washington. And when George Washington's troops were encamped at Morristown, George Washington used to come and visit the family. And after dinner one evening, their nephew, Thomas Ogden, engaged in playful swordplay with George Washington, inadvertently cut him on the hand, and it's said to be the only injury that George Washington suffered in the American Revolution.
So how did Ogdensburg get its name?
When Samuel Ogden bought all the land, he decreed it would be called Ogdensburg, but it was actually developed by a fellow by the name of David Parrish, who created massive sheep farms up there in the area right after the American Revolution, 1790 to 1820.
And this interview is taking place in our studio in Plattsburgh. Does Plattsburgh play a role in your book?
I've got an entire chapter on Plattsburgh in the book, and the focus in the beginning is about Zephaniah Platt, for whom Plattsburgh is named. Zephaniah Platt was born in Long Island and moved to Dutchess County along the Hudson River area. Was a very successful attorney, very successful judge, was involved in politics. As a land speculator, he bought thousands of acres of land on the west shore of Lake Champlain, which included today's city of Plattsburgh. And he decreed in a deed that I saw, in a letter as well, that it should be named Plattsburgh in his honor. But there was also the question, when I did the research, if Zephaniah Platt and his wife Mary actually ever came to Plattsburgh. They sent their sons to develop the area, but it was unclear if they had actually come to the area. And I found that they had indeed retired to the area, and they are buried in the local Riverside Cemetery.
It must be fun to research all these facts and uncover things that most people don't know about.
It is a lot of fun. Often you're playing detective. Reminds me of the PBS show History Detective. You do a lot of that.
So what attracts you to this particular period of history? First of all, what decades are we talking about in your book?
We're talking about the 30 years after the American Revolution. And it started with my first book, which was written about the township of Johnsburg, where I live, in the southeastern corner of the park. Area was developed by a fellow named John Thurman, who owned most of northern Warren County, northern Washington County, some of Essex County, and some of Clinton County, who, amongst other things, like setting up a sawmill and a gristmill, built the first calico printing mill in New York State, the 7th in the United States. And the mystery for me, why would you build a plant that printed cotton fabric when obviously we don't grow cotton around here? And that started my investigations, and I discovered that Thurman was not alone. There was a whole series of people trying to take advantage of the Adirondacks at that time.
Well, you are someone who does a lot of philanthropy in the Adirondack region. You're concerned with the year-round residents of the Adirondack Park and improving the lives of the people who live here. So would you actually want to live in the Adirondacks if these developers had had their way?
It's an interesting question, Paul. I clearly love the Adirondacks. I love the people of the Adirondacks. It would be just conjecture to think what it might be like, but I would hope that if some of these schemes, if I may call them that, had worked out, there would be more and better jobs for people that live in the Adirondacks that actually paid benefits. I think the Adirondacks are large enough that you could have a large area remaining forever wild and wilderness, but it would be my dream that had they succeeded, that folks could make a living here and be comfortable doing that.
So it really would have helped, perhaps, if some of these people's plans had gone through and if we had had some major cities here.
Again, just conjecture, but I think there are also some lessons here. And I think it's important, if we are to think of a future, if we're envision a future for the Adirondacks, we understand its past. This particular era about which I wrote, there's very little has been written in the past. So it's been a lot of new information, a lot of new perspectives to people who thought of themselves as very knowledgeable on the history of the Adirondacks. This is an era that they know very little about.
Now, what draws you to writing about history in general?
I've always loved history. My middle name is Lincoln. I have studied history since probably 3rd grade when I started reading about the Civil War. And what intrigues me is the understanding that they were people back then, just like we're people today. They had the same uncertainties. Life was not black and white, as it's often portrayed in high school history classes. And it's interesting to see how these people challenged the problems that they faced and how they resolved them.
So are you working on another book?
I'm working on several books at the moment. I've got several people wanting me to work on an Adirondack novel, historical novel. I've also done some research about the impact of the Civil War on the Adirondacks, and how devastating it was to the populations here. So that may be another book. I'm still not sure.
We'll look forward to more coming from you then.
Great. Thank you, Paul.